Good morning. It is still morning, and welcome to Worcester Business Journal's Webcast Forum on building a better business through diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm Brad Kane, editor at the Worcester Business Journal, and I'm joined by a panel of CEOs and diversity, equity, and inclusion experts. We're going to share how companies can begin to build a more diverse and inclusive work environment, what are some of the major challenges, as well as the best practices that assure a strong company. This special session is brought to you by the support of a number of local organizations who are making a commitment to building a more diverse and inclusive workplace. Special thanks to Berkshire Bank, Fallon Health, Fidelity Bank, Hanover Insurance Group, National Grid, UMass Medical School, Unibank, and Webster 5. On our panel, joining us today are Dr. Javier Ceballos, President of Framingham State University, Maritza Cruz, Director of Racial and Gender Equity at the YWCA, Central Massachusetts, Don Doyle, President and CEO, Webster 5, Marcy Reed, President of National Grid, and Bonnie Walker, Director of Equity and Inclusion at Worcester Academy. And quickly before we jump into the panel discussion, just a couple of quick notes for our audience today. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can. Today's webcast is also being recorded, and a link to that recording will be sent to all of you after the event. All right, so this hour will go by quickly, so just jumping right into the first question here. So while diversity, equity, and inclusion have been among the priorities for many businesses for years, efforts toward better DEI ramped up in the wake of George Floyd's killing by police at the end of May. So directing this question first to the CEOs on our panel, and Marcy, let's start with you. How have your efforts changed since George Floyd's death?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's such an important topic, so thanks for giving it space. Yeah, since the killing of George Floyd, we've done a number of things. Fairly immediately after that, we held what we call race dialogues. They were open Teams calls like Zoom for anyone in the company to jump in. And on our first call, we had over 3,000 people join us. It was really an opportunity for employees to be heard and for everyone to listen and kind of be with each other. That started out, I think what that allowed us and our employees to do is basically embrace that we needed to change. We actually were already going down the path of hiring a new role, which is a chief diversity officer. We had it embedded within HR before, but we were elevating a chief diversity officer to be hired reporting to our CEO. And so that was already happening, but we knew we needed to double down on things like our pay audits and looking at our pay practices. We've made commitments to achieving 50% of our senior leadership, as well as our executive committee, as well as all of our new entrants, 50% diversity by 2025, improving our supplier diversity. So really just doubling down on stuff we already had going on, because we know though we've done okay, we've not done great. So it has certainly shined a light, and we are pressing on with it.
And Don, let's maybe talk a little bit about what Webster 5 has done as well.
Thank you, Brad. At some levels, there really have not been any changes. We previously made diversity, equity, inclusion a priority here at Webster 5. We had an internal diversity, equity, and inclusion committee in place already. I have made the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion pledge back in February, and all of our employees had completed unconscious bias training during the first quarter of the year. But after the George Floyd killing, the conversation at Webster 5 really changed to include discussions on racism. We initiated internal conversations about racism and actually hired a consultant to help us with those difficult conversations. All the employees of the bank and inclusive of our board has completed workshops on racism and the impact it's had on individuals and businesses in our community. I believe with these conversations, the DEI culture here at the bank has improved. And as overall, I think we're, as we said, as we're trying to develop our culture, I think it's been enhanced, but there's still a lot of work to do. So we look forward to continuing these conversations. They can be difficult, but again, I think as an organization, the shift since the George Floyd killings has been more concentrating on discussion of racism, the impact it's had on individuals in our community, as well as businesses in our community. The other change we did make, the bank did not have a diversity, equity, and inclusion or a chief DEI officer. We're a small organization. We only have 150 employees. So we did elevate our HR director as the DEI officer here for the bank. And myself and she are the co-chairs of our diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. So again, the primary change has been the shift in the conversation itself with regards to conversations on racism.
And then Javier, a little bit about, Framingham State was recognized, nationally even before this year as a bit of a standard bearer in the higher education industry for its diversity efforts, both among staff and students. And I know before, we were talking in prep for this that, your efforts have definitely taken on a new tone as well since George Floyd's killing. How exactly did that change? And, why did you feel propelled to do more on top of what you were already, being honored for doing?
Yeah, well, I think that the George Floyd killing was a moment that really defined the country. It's like the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, it was a lot of things have been happening, and we all know the whole list of names of people that have been murdered before. But the way that it happened, at the moment that it happened, it was so profound that I think that it shook the entire conscience of the country. And it was like a wake-up call to all of us to think about what it meant. For many years, we have been thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. That has been one of the things I've been doing for many, many years in my career, trying to work on that. But the George Floyd murder actually changed the conversation on our campus. A few years ago, we hired a vice president, or created the position of vice president for diversity and inclusion. We hired a new vice president just a year and a half ago. And talking to her, she actually said something very important to me that after that happened, said we have to shift the conversation. It's no longer diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have to take the bull by the horns. It is anti-racism. And we have to really become an anti-racist organization. So in June, I sent a letter to the campus making a pledge that our institution was going to become an anti-racist institution, not only a diversity, equity, and inclusion institution, but we have to take concrete steps. And that has to include everyone. It has to be part of our strategic plan. It has to be part of our life as an institution. So one of the things that we're doing right now is we ask every department to have conversations about racism and becoming an anti-racist institution. As Don just mentioned, these are not easy conversations. They are very hard, and we need some guidance. So our Office of Diversity and Inclusion has been providing specific guidance to offices on how to have these conversations, knowing that the conversations are going to be difficult, knowing that the conversations are going to be painful, but also knowing that it's crucial that we have these conversations. We have to get these things out in the open, talk about them, so that we can actually move forward. So that is going on right now. A number of other things, our faculty in the sciences in particular, in STEM, also took the initiative of taking a whole anti-racist perspective to the curriculum. And it's easy for us to think in, anthropology, sociology, history, philosophy. It's easy to incorporate history and things about anti-racism. But when you think about physics and biology and chemistry, we tend to think that the sciences do not have those biases, and they do. And that's what our faculty have been looking at. And I think that it's a concerted effort that is going to take a while for the campus to really have this long conversation, but I think it's very, very engaging. And I'm really excited about the work that our campus is doing on this particular issue.
Thank you, Javier. And I think Bonnie, maybe, again, talking about what we were talking before in preparation for this, that racism and a lack of diversity in business and, kind of everywhere in American society and worldwide were certainly issues well before 2020, and, certainly won't be solved over, one summer or 1 year of, everyone taking a more concerted effort to address them. So, maybe first, if you could talk a little bit about that, and then maybe from a higher elevation standpoint as well, how do we manage such a large amorphous problem that's sort of defined almost human history for generations? and how can we use the cultural moment that we're in now and have been in, you know, since George Floyd's death and everything that's happened since then. How can we use that cultural moment to make greater strides toward obtaining meaningful diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, I'll say absolutely. This is not new. As a DEI practitioner, the work has been happening for a long time. And I think that there have been historical ebbs and flows to leaning into the efforts. But as Javier mentioned, we are in a kind of a breaking point. I would say that many are experiencing a collective awakening to systemic racism in a new and very blatant in-your-face way because of the events of the summer. And how this has continued to devalue Black, Indigenous, and people of color lives for centuries. So we're really coming to grips with our history as a nation. This is a global issue compounded by pandemic and other oppression and challenges. But quite frankly, I need to put out there that America has been pathological about race. In order for oppressive structures to be dismantled, we really must stop lying about our history and the impact that it has had on people in this country. And not just people of color, all people have been impacted by this history. We have to really think very critically about these oppressive structures in order to dismantle them. We have to tell the truth about our narratives, and we have to tell all of the stories and all of the narratives. Because there's great impact in that. So what we need to do instead is include all experiences, tell the stories of all people that are part of America, and exactly change the conversation. So trainings and information about implicit bias and privilege and you know, the colorblind mentality, all of these things are important and they need to continue. But we really have to center the conversation around anti-racism as a country, as organizations, as individuals. And I would say that the steps for doing that begin with not being silent in this moment, particularly as leaders. I commend everybody that's on this call and the leadership across organizations for people standing up and using their voice. If you're at the top of the food chain, you need to use your power for good. And I think that is absolutely about having a voice to these issues. I think holding conversations and learning opportunities, like folks mentioned, that happened after George Floyd's murder is important. But what's also important is that the conversations don't stop. It's easier to have them when we're in a place of crisis. But if we don't continue the conversations, we continue to repeat the problems of our history. I think leading anti-racist efforts with empathy while leaning into the voices of Black and Indigenous and people of color colleagues and being very self-reflective is important. So it's easy to point and look at our organizations and say, here's the problem, or it's this or that. But when do we look inward and say, I'm part of the problem too? What am I going to do as an individual? And I think conversations, of course, they create change and they're meaningful, but we also have to move to action. So how are we leaning into our policies and practices and initiatives and putting the conversations and what we're hearing to action? And then finally, I think we really have to frame anti-racism not as a moment that we're in right now, but what are we going to do going forward? We have to frame this as an ongoing effort.
Brad, do you mind if I respond to that?
Absolutely, go right ahead.
Bonnie, that was awesome. And, you know, everything you say gives me such hope. And the reason I have great hope for society and for even in this bubble that we're living in on this webcast, the business community, is because everything that has happened and the awakening that many people have had no longer gives folks in our organizations who maybe were utilizing inappropriately their white privilege, myself included, but also a lot of my white male colleagues. I'm married to one, so I get it. But in the past where it had been able to be tamped down, society is erupting on this topic. And so I have huge confidence that once and for all, though you are right, Brad, it won't be dealt with overnight or over a summer, and it is large and amorphous. I think finally we're on our way.
I'd like to add to that. I completely agree with everything that my colleague Bonnie has said. One thing and completely agree with Dr. Ceballos, what he's saying, that this is not about diversity and inclusion only. It's really talking about racism openly and anti-racism, the work that needs to be done there. And also acknowledging the fact as a collective, as a country, that it was not just the killings of, African Americans in this country that's been ongoing for a long time, but also the whole pandemic of COVID-19 and how it has been devastating, Black and Brown, primarily Latino communities here in Massachusetts. Again, because if you look at the roots of that, it's going to show the disparities, the racial disparities that have existed in our communities for a very long time, which is part of the systemic racism that contributes again to this eruption that we've had in this nation. And I'm really glad that, it's unfortunate that it takes a crisis for people to wake up and go, oh, what am I going to do about this? But I am really, very hopeful that, first of all, that, the Worcester Business Journal is doing this, and it's, it's in the business community, and glad to see the CEOs, because this takes decision makers at the top in order to address this. Oftentimes I get brought in and I'll have people that really don't have the ability to make decisions. But when you have yourselves as CEOs recognizing this and already doing some work around it, that is very hopeful. But we have to call it what it is. We're dealing with, racism. We're dealing with white supremacy, which is a word that people, when they hear it, it gets them all, stirred up. But these are the things we have to recognize. We are dealing, we have to do anti-racist work. That's what it is. And diversity and inclusion and equity are the outcomes that we want out of doing that work of addressing racism. So.
Maritza, I think while you're speaking, I know a lot of what you do at the YW is advising organizations and businesses on things they can do to address racism and increase diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, maybe just in that vein, sort of advice for our attendees today. What are some meaningful steps that businesses and organization leaders can take to begin addressing these issues?
Well, I think with some of the things that have already been stated here by some of the companies, Verizon and Webster 5 and Framingham State, are doing already a lot of that work. But I think it's continuing the conversations. And I really think that it's extremely important to bring in people who really know how to facilitate these conversations. You bring them in, okay, so once you've have discussed that, what are the actions that you're going to take as a company, as a business? Because racism, it doesn't affect just people of color. It affects all of us as a society, as a nation, as a country. So it affects everything that we do and all the institutions that we have here. So ongoing conversations, yeah, that's a must. I would also, as looking at your human resources department, I'm glad that some of you already are starting to attach that to it, because oftentimes when we do hiring, one of the problems that companies have is either bringing in diverse populations or retaining diverse individuals working within these institutions or companies. So that needs to be addressed. And oftentimes, we have bias. Every single one of us has bias as according to who we think has the potential to do a good job or not. And we often pick people that look like us and sound like us and think like us. So it's really, your HR departments really need to be looked at and revamped, because that's the first step for anyone trying to get into any company. And that's also the department that has to enforce and make sure that there is compliance when it comes to affirmative action and equity and inclusion and diversity. We also have to acknowledge, like Bonnie stated, not being silent when something happens, addressing it immediately. I tell companies, you should all have a racism policy, zero tolerance for racism. That's it. There's zero tolerance for that. That's something that should be implemented in every, whether you're a not-for-profit, whether you're a business, whether you're whatever it may be, that really needs to be in there, because that is telling people, that's telling folks that we have no tolerance for racism. We mean business, and that's being intentional. Everything that's done has to be done with intentionality. It's like you can speak things, but if it's not done with intentionality, it doesn't matter. Also creating and fostering by having these conversations and creating these spaces, you're also fostering a place where you do have a level where people who are in marginalized groups may feel more welcomed. Because, when we talk about, racism and racial equity, you have to put into that all the intersectionalities. If you're a woman of color, if you're LGBTQIA, if you are disabled, all of these play into that factor. So acknowledging all of that and making sure that people have a space where they are comfortable to be able to talk to someone or with whom, and that they're being heard. It's not just lip service. That's a way that you do keep employees and they're happy and they're more productive. People are more productive when they're happier at places. Let me see. And meet regularly. I think as CEOs, you all have to be involved directly and not just put it off to someone who is an HR or your chief diversity officer, but really as CEOs, it's important for your employees and even for your business partners to see that you are actually involved directly with this, because this is an important topic. It's an important action that you're taking for your company, for your business, and also just as a member of society, that, we do care. We have to move this forward. We have to continue talking about it, but it's also taking action. And also, oftentimes I'll see CEOs, they'll step up and then they'll just walk away and say, okay, I handed it over to you. Please do not do that. And I don't think this group does that, because obviously you're very involved in the work that you're doing with your companies. And I think that has made a huge difference probably within your organizations and companies. So I would say recommend that, what you do is very, very good, and that other companies can follow suit.
Great.
Yeah,
Well,
Let me just add something about what you were talking. Something that I think is really important is the retention of the people that we hire to our companies, or to our institutions, to our universities, because that is one of the challenges. Is to we can bring people in, if they don't feel embraced, if they don't feel comfortable, if they don't feel that they're part of a support group, that they feel that they belong, they will go someplace else. And that's something I think that is a very important point that you bring in. We have to really make them feel that they belong to our institutions. And we try to do that through different mechanisms.
I completely agree that, if you want to have a strong diversity, equity, and inclusion culture, it has to start with the top. It has to start with the CEO. The employee base has to feel that you're driving that cultural change. And depending on your corporate structure, if you have a board, the board has to be completely involved. Which has taken place here at Webster 5. When I took the pledge going back earlier this year, I had conversations with the board beforehand. They fully endorsed that. And I said they've gone through the training themselves and the workshops. So it really has to start from the top. And any opportunity you have, we have once a quarter, we have an all employee meeting. Part of the conversations at those meetings includes myself talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So they feel that it's something that I'm not going to just talk about once. It's something that is part of the culture. And I completely agree with regards to bringing in a consultant to help with initiating the difficult conversations about racism. After the George Floyd killing, going back to May, the next committee meeting that we had, again, as I mentioned, we have a diversity, equity, inclusion committee. Myself and our HR director, who is our chief diversity officer, try to initiate that conversation ourselves. And we quickly realized after that meeting that we are not experts in that. And we probably never will be. That's not our training. So immediately we, like I said, hired an outside consultant, and we just got gone through that training over those last few weeks, and it was outstanding. So I highly recommend that you consider bringing in an outside expert.
It makes a difference because we're dealing with people's traumas, and you're talking generational trauma, and you're talking, and this is not just, again, I will keep saying that this is not just about people of color, it's about all of us. It's about every single one of us, because racism creates trauma for everyone. So I think that's really important that's ongoing.
So obviously we want to encourage as much audience participation as possible. And we actually have a number of questions piling up, and I do promise to get to those very, very shortly. One thing I did want to kind of bring home, or with a question with all of you before moving on to those, is, obviously anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion are all the right thing to do. I think everyone agrees on that. But businesses are so much just about dollars and cents and the bottom line. I guess beyond being the right thing to do, and I think Marcy, I'll start with you. Why is anti-racism and diversity, equity, and inclusion good for business?
Well, I guess I would start by respectfully disagreeing with your comment, which is that it's all about the bottom line, the finance. That I will say that has been historically the case, but really over the last, predating George Floyd, over the last few years, companies have increasingly been looking at the responsible business aspect of their organizations. So we indeed put out our responsible business charter. I want to say it was about three months ago, but it deals with how do we treat the environment, how do we treat our people, and this topic is enveloped in, what are the governance? So ESG that investors have been talking about for some time. It's no longer okay to just provide a good dividend. You have to perform in all of the other areas. ESG, environmental, social, and governance. But so if you assume that you do that, what your question is, what are some of the benefits that it brings? And there are tons of them. I think it was already mentioned that employee engagement goes up. When employee engagement goes up, productivity goes up, etc. People feel more embraced. You become an employer of choice. People don't want to leave; they want to stay with you. If you shake up how you do your recruiting and your talent onboarding, you can change even where you go for talent. We have actually gotten rid of a number of colleges and universities, not Framingham State, you'll be good to know, Javier, that we've historically gone to for whatever reason. And we look at the metrics that they have, their student body, they're not good enough, so we're not going there anymore. And meanwhile, we're increasing our presence at the HBCUs. The training that everyone has talked about, we too are doing that, and that just brings an awareness that people can bring to the table to improve, bring more perspectives. A lot of companies, organizations have employee resource groups, bringing them into the picture, helping them with the decision making, helping them create the goals that we have as an organization, will make them more representative of not just our customers and society around us, but also obviously our employees. I'll just tell you a really quick story because it just struck me when one of you was talking earlier. Talking about systemic racism, here's a sad but true fact. Everyone's heard of Mass Save. You call them, everyone pays a tiny little bit on your utility bill. You call them, you get a free home energy audit. They give you light bulbs, they give you weather stripping and all that kind of stuff. It's great. Guess what? If you don't have upgraded electrical systems in your house, they won't enter. You can't participate in Mass Save. Yeah. And we have a number of electric customers who have the old fashioned, like my grandparents used to have, knob and tube wiring within their home. If you have that in your building, Mass Save will just walk away. That is systemic racism, because guess who's living in those homes? As a company, we're actually going to go in and we're going to change out that electrical system on our own dime. So then those people can play in Mass Save programs. I mean, it's that kind of stuff, that kind of thinking, that this training, that these events have, and an employee, a low-level employee came up with that idea. So there's so much good that can come to your company if you do this right. It's not just about the bottom line, Brad.
Donna, I think I'll ask you the same original question. Why is DEI good for your business?
Well, I think more collaboration, more creativity, innovation, better decisions, and better outcomes. And let me, that's a lot to chew on, but let me give you an example. If the bank decides to, or is thinking about establishing a new service that he wants to provide to its customers or a new product, we typically put together a project team. If that project team consisted of 10 white males over the age of 40, what's going to be the end result? Probably a product that white males over the 40 would want to have. But our customer base is very different. Our customer base is very diverse. So that project team really should consist of a diverse group, including gender, race, socioeconomic backgrounds. And I think that outcome that you're going to have is going to be much better if you have a diverse project team. And we've seen that here at the bank. And I think that's important. I think, bottom line, and I totally agree with Marcy, that there's the reason that we have are developing a stronger diversity, equity, inclusion committee, is outside of the bottom line, but obviously it could have a major positive impact on the bottom line as well.
And Javier, I know that Framingham State obviously has a very tangible reason to be going for DEI other than the obviously amorphous reason. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that as well.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was just going to comment also on Marcy's point about some universities not doing the work and some universities being engaged. Right now, our institution is about 30% students of color and 40% Pell Grant recipients, about 45% first generation going to college. That is a typical profile of a state institution. But we know that college education changes the lives of people. We know that it is the door to the middle class. We know the baccalaureate degree is really the path to really get a much better paying job. We have the statistics. We know that over a lifetime, people with a college degree make over $1 million more than people with a high school degree. That's of course an average. I mean, not everybody needs to have a college degree. I agree with that, but we have to give the opportunity to people to get that choice of getting a college degree. To do that, a few years ago, 6 years ago, together with Mass Bay Community College, which is our neighbor and partner here in the Framingham area, we started what we call the College Planning Collaborative. That is an enterprise that goes down to meet with our middle and high school students and with the families and try to get them to think about college as part of the future. And going to college, and it goes against to the whole bias and implicit racism, etc. If you don't think about going to college when you're in 5th grade, when you get to middle school, you do not take the classes that you need to take. You don't take the math, you don't take the writing, you don't take the labs, you don't take the sciences. So by the time that you're a junior or senior in high school, if you're going to be thinking about going to college and you haven't done that work, you have to do a lot of remedial work. And that is already delaying you for 1, 2, 3 years in your hope to go to college. So we are working with families in the area with specifically 5 districts that have a lot of low income and first generation students, to help them think about what would it take to go to college, plan. And we're doing that also in Portuguese and in Spanish, because we understand that although the students are fluent in English, the families are not. Mm-hmm. And in many cultures and in many traditions, going to college or whatever decision is a family decision. So we have to work with the families to make sure that they work in that direction. Obviously, for us as a university, and recruitment has 2 functions. So we have 2 ways of doing recruitment. One is students, and I'm talking about that. The other one is recruiting faculty. And getting faculty of color is not as easy as it is to get students, because they have to have a PhD, they have to be in the college track, etc. But we do have faculty of color, and about 18% of our faculty in campus are now faculty of color. So we're very proud of the efforts that we have made in those 2 directions. Now, one of the huge initiatives that we have right now in our campus is to become a Hispanic serving institution. And to become an HSI, it's a federal standard. You have to be 25% of your students have to be Hispanic or identify as Hispanic. We're about 16% right now. But the challenge is not to become a Hispanic enrolling institution, because that is what you get when you get 25%, is to become a Hispanic serving institution. And that goes for all other students too. We have to be African-American serving institution, white students serving institution, disabled students serving institution. We have to really give them the wraparound services that they need to be successful. So when I went to college many years ago, and I'm sure that all of us had the same thing, the dean of admissions looked at us and said, look to your right, look to your left, only one of you will graduate. And universities were so proud of that fact. Now, we want to tell students, look to your right, look to your left, make sure that all of you graduate and that you collaborate together and that you succeed together. So that's one of the things that I think that we really have to change that dynamic, and we're trying to do that. So becoming an institution that serves all students and all the students' needs is the way to address all these issues, because our students are going to be more and more students of color, students from low-income families, first-generation students going to college, and we have to really make sure that we provide them with all the resources that we have to ensure that they are successful and that they go out to be productive citizens, pay taxes, contribute to the companies and that hired them, and are productive citizens in the country.
Bonnie and Maurice, I don't know if you wanted to add anything about direct business benefits to pursuing DEI.
Absolutely. So I'm going to name back what I think I heard, because I think they're really important to name. DEI grows your talent pool. It reduces employee turnover. It increases profits and grows your market. It drives employee productivity and performance. It fosters creativity and innovation. And I think, to Marcy's point at the beginning, it has to be integral to your business bottom line. It's in alignment with your business bottom line. DEI is not something that you put up on a shelf somewhere and you go and take it down when there's a crisis, or when all of a sudden students of color aren't happy, or employees are in an uproar, or right. It's integral to every department and every operation, a cross section of your organization, from top to bottom and bottom to top. And I think without efforts to DEI, those other areas suffer. So I would also say one last point is, when we don't talk about race and we don't talk about anti-racism and DEI in businesses, and we kind of keep that again on the shelf at home or outside of work, there's an elephant in the room. Whether we acknowledge it or not, people's identities, who they are, is part of who they are, and they can't separate that when they go to work. So, if you can't show up as your most authentic self at work, you're not going to be your best self at work. You're not going to be your most productive self at work. I think race is extremely complicated, which is why we don't want to talk about it, because it's individual, it's interpersonal, it's institutional, it's cultural, it's societal, and it's structural. So the fact that we make that the core of our business and we start the conversations there and ask the right questions is really how we create change.
And I perfectly said, I think one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that the demographics in this country are changing. By 2042, whites will be the minority. I mean, think about that. That's 22 years away. We have already parts of this country where you actually have children that the white children are actually the minority already within the school systems. So if you don't start to address and incorporate the issue of race within your businesses, you're going to fail. You're not going to continue to be a sustainable business. And it's not just about retaining, your business and what you're doing, but also who you're servicing. So if I'm the kind of person that if I see your business that's not really being mindful and servicing the needs of me as a person of color, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to bother with it. So I think that's very important. And I like Marcy, what you said when you said that, this idea came from a low-level employee. Having these conversations with all your employees, you have to value all your employees, and set aside these biases. because from there you get these ideas. And again, it's all systemic, these issues, here you are tooting this whole thing. And I'm glad that, now your company is going to be actually addressing that issue, because that is systemic racism. So continue having these conversations. I'm actually very hopeful listening to all of you speak. It gives me a lot of hope, because when you've been doing this work as long as I'm sure as Bonnie has, you get to a point where you're like, you keep going on. And I never call them trainings. I call them workshops, because it's ongoing work. We don't live in a race neutral society, so it will always be ongoing work.
Yeah. Maritza, you mentioned, and I think Bonnie did too earlier, that the conversations are difficult and they're uncomfortable. Well, guess what? If you just keep having the conversations, they'll get less and less uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
Perfect, right? So
absolutely.
I applaud the WBJ for having this conversation, and it's all the more reason for all of us inside our organizations to just keep talking about it. And if people are uncomfortable, then they're the ones who need to be sitting at the table having the conversation. Yeah. So a couple of you have said that, but I'm a firm believer that we will get past this. It'll take a while, but we have to be talking about it. Have to be.
Yeah. And one thing I just want to add the accountability factor. You all need to hold yourselves accountable. Each and every one of us, we have to hold ourselves accountable, because we can get very comfortable. We're doing the work. We're doing this, we're accomplishing this. The accountability factor has to be ongoing. Just like Donald, you said, where you meet with your team, and you meet with all of you, this is ongoing. That's about accountability. Because one thing that I see, I'm working with the group here in the city where there was a letter that was signed, and all the companies signed off on it, especially with the racial unrest that was happening, the social, turmoils and so on. And so now we're following up with some of these companies, and some of these companies have actually were like, well, I don't know what to do. I'm walking away from this, and we're like going after them like, no, you can't do that because you actually signed on. So accountability is something very important that I think that because it takes a lot of work. This is ongoing work, and accountability is part of that.
So questions are piling up here in a very good way. So thank you, audience, and keep them coming. And we will try to get to as many as possible. Don, I'm going to put you on the spot now. And then I know, Maritza, you're going to have an easy answer for this one as well. But several audience members are asking specifically for names of consultants they can bring into their businesses. Maybe you don't have to give their phone number and contact information, but maybe if you could just maybe recommend a couple of one or two people that actually do this work for other businesses, because I'm imagining most of our audience is probably on the smaller side of the businesses. So if there's one or two people you would recommend who do this work.
The individual that we used to help us initiate these challenging conversations, Valerie Zalesi Wyndham, name of her company is Promoting Good. And she's been doing this work for a few years, and she did an outstanding job.
And then Maritza, I believe you yourself do this work directly for other businesses.
Yes,
well.
we do. Yes. Well, first of all, I would of course recommend the YWCA of Central Massachusetts. I've been there for 5 years doing specifically this work. We do the consulting for not-for-profits, for businesses, for institutions. We actually are working with Worcester State University at this time. We also have a contract with the city of Worcester to do racial equity work. And that's what we call it. It's also informing and educating, upper management and CEOs. We do go into your company and do an assessment of, actually a racial equity assessment, because equity is very broad in general. And I do this work directly. So there's a lot of things that we do as an organization. And not only that, the most important thing is to have the expertise in the subject matter. I think one of the things that is coming up right now, and I'm sure Bonnie is too, is that you all of a sudden have a lot of people saying, oh, I'm doing racial equity work, or I can do anti-racism work. This is work that's taken us for a lot of years. in order to be able to come to the levels where we are. And so I would consider myself an expert in the matter when it comes to anti-racist and racial equity work very precisely.
So obviously YW, and then as Don said, the Promoting Good, Valerie Zolizzi Wyndham over there. Any of our other panelists want to send some business towards a specific people that you know do this work? Or
I was going to try to type it in the chat, but I'm glad I can do it verbally because I'm not a technical person. The partnership in Boston does this kind of work. Center State CEO in, I want to say Albany, does this work. In fact, Center State is who we used at National Grid to do the training for our executive team.
I would recommend, excuse me, the Ideas Consultant Collaborative. They work closely in school systems and, higher education, but also elementary, middle, secondary school. And all biases aside, I have to recommend Mr. Edward Walker, who I also put out there often. He's my husband, because he focuses, like Marcy said, very specifically on culturally responsive community and education, and also on anti-racism. And there is a distinct difference between, implicit bias training, privilege training, cultural competency training, and culturally responsive community and anti-racism training. And I have a number of names of folks that do all of those things. I'm more in tune with the educational realm, but if folks wanted to reach out to me, I can absolutely share those with folks.
And I think that's important also, that there's very specific areas. For example, you do have racial equity educators and facilitators that work specifically with schools. You have some that work specifically with, business companies. So you have people that have their expertise in this area for different institutions and what's needed to be done. But again, the difference is, inclusion and diversity is very different from racial equity work, because racial equity is an action that's taken against anti-racism.
And I would just mention that although it's not a consultant, but many universities like mine, we have in our website a lot of resources that can be used to start the conversation, to read materials, to share materials. And if you go to our institution right now, our website for the diversity of inclusion, for the Division of Diversity and Inclusion, we have a lot of things that are listed about anti-racism, about diversity, equity, inclusion. So, and as I said, not only our university, but many institutions would have that in the websites available for people to use as resources.
And I also want to mention that the ywcacm.org, we have a curated list of resources that are specifically, again, around anti-racism and racial equity. It's their books, their articles, their readings, their podcasts, their documentaries, their films. So please do feel free to go on there and use that as a resources. And it is a curated list that we have developed, which can be used by anyone actually for any topic that you may have.
All right, and then just quickly in the chat, Robert T. Jones, Chief Empowerment Officer at T. Lee Associates, mentioned he does this kind of work as well for all of these looking to maybe sign up with an organization. Obviously, very strong recommendations from all of you. Thank you. And then just jumping into a question that we actually got right before this started, and this is a kind of multifaceted, but I think it's a good place to start. So question being, in several places I've worked, there's diversity among the workforce when you look at the numbers, but how much inclusion and understanding can happen when people of like backgrounds are concentrated within departments that don't necessarily interact? How can an organizational culture acknowledge these considerations and how they happen? How can we establish connections between these silo groups to promote greater understanding and inclusion? How can we make changes so there is more diversity within departments throughout an organization? Bonnie, I'll put you on the spot first, and then whoever wants to jump in after her, go right ahead.
I think it's really important to build community across kind of different affinities. So if your organization has ERGs, employee resource groups, that's a great way to bring people from like affinities together that may or may not be in the same department. to come together in camaraderie, but also to talk about issues and to ask questions about maybe where are the gaps. Inclusion is really about this sense of belonging. So, obviously the beginning of this pipeline is recruitment and hiring. We want to do better to diversify our workforce, our faculty at colleges and universities. But in absence of that diversity, how do we build spaces for people of color in organizations where they feel a sense of belonging? I'll give a quick example. When I was at WPI, I would host new student orientations, and some of them by affinity or demographic groups. So whether it's first generation of students of color, and I was on that stage, I had my notes ready to welcome parents and families, and I was sidelined in a conversation before I got on that stage about a student thanking me so much because I was their first point of contact. And thanking me, but saying, I'm so anxious because I feel like I am not supposed to be here. I don't belong. And this was a student of color. And so the first thing I did when I got up on that stage is I said, I want you all, let's all start from the same baseline, right? Assumption. You are all here at WPI, not because you're students of color who happen to come to WPI. You are WPI students who happen to be of color. It's a different conversation. And the way that people internalize racism or being othered or difference impacts them very, very deeply. And just as the imposition of racism impacts people. So coming from external forces and other people. So I would say, what we have to do is create spaces that are safe for people of color, affinity spaces, or for women, for Latinx folks, for whoever it is to come together, but then also cross conversations, right? Because if we do everything by affinity, how are we asking the right questions and building a place for understanding across difference? So I think whatever you call them, just make sure that you frame them appropriately. Community forums, listening circles, debriefs, facilitated dialogue series. I think those are all important ways to create a sense of connectivity across the community and also build understanding.
And I just want to add to that, that's something that we do. And we also host affinity groups also even for white people. That's important to have that. I mean, we have affinity based because you can then have open conversations. I think oftentimes people, when you talk about race, it's uncomfortable, and people, I'm not going to say that because I might be perceived as being a racist, or I may sound ignorant. So it's important to provide these spaces for all people, not just people of color, but people of color. I mean, right now we're doing that. I've done this with groups of women, and I've done it with students and faculty. I have faculty of color. I have white faculty, white students of color. And it's providing again that opportunity, that safe enough space to have these conversations and move forward. But then eventually coming together to be able to talk as that one environment or that culture which you find yourself in. But that's super important.
And I would just add to that, in most cases, there's a distinction between the camaraderie and the conversation, that safe conversation that can happen in the affinity spaces where, you're with people from like backgrounds, identities, lived experiences, and it's really a place of camaraderie, sometimes venting, sometimes questioning. And that we consider that a safe space. And then when you open it up more broadly, and you can't necessarily navigate the safety of that space, we call those brave spaces. So trying to provide both within your community is incredibly important.
Yeah.
I would just add one more thing that is also important, that is that the executive teams have to reflect that diversity as well. Because if you don't have people at the C level that look like the employees, and if everybody is, from the president or CEO to all the vice presidents, are white males, that should not reflect of the institution. So you have to really hire the people that reflect the employees. The boards have to hire more women CEOs and more people of color as CEOs, and the CEOs have to hire more vice presidents that reflect that diversity of all employees that they have.
And going to get on to a couple of our questions here. Obviously, most of the conversation has centered around, anti-racism and, addressing underserved populations from a racial and ethnic standpoint. But, also maybe expanding beyond that, just talking about inclusion of all underserved populations. So, we have questions specifically about people with disabilities, or people who just might be low income and not have the same opportunities people with higher income. How do all these values, it seems kind of inherent, but how do all these values tie into hitting all underserved populations, and how can you make sure you're having the appropriate conversations to, I guess, get the best talent out of your community?
Well, I think
go ahead, Marcy.
I think Maritza earlier talked about we have to think of all people, and that's really what that question gets to. How do you define diversity? For us, it happens to be professionals of color, women, and people with disabilities. We're going to change that starting in the new year to include LGBTQ populations, and one other, which I actually embarrassingly can't remember right now. But everybody has to be coming to the table. So you can't and you have to have your metrics that actually create accountability also, as Maritza said earlier. So you can't just have, you can't discount low-income white people, maybe because they also didn't go to college or something like that, or you can't discount any one population, whether they're your customers, clients, or they're your employees.
I think absolutely the focus on for any population, whether underrepresented, underserved, marginalized, othered in any way, the focus has to be on inclusion and equity. So how are you framing, evaluating, assessing, and constantly reworking your initiatives, your policies, your practices, and the conversations that are on the table, because the conversations are going to shift over time too, and asking the right questions and asking the right questions of all constituents. Equity is not about equal. And I think that we struggle with that. Yeah. We struggle with that as organizations. We struggle with that as people, right? We're taught to share and everybody gets the same ration and it has to be fair. And equity can be fair, but it is not the same. So equity can look different, or serving people can look different for different people, because different populations, different people, different students, different employees have different needs. And how do we do our best to meet those needs for all people? That's really how we get to equitable practices and policies. So inclusion is not enough. It's great that we, the sense of belonging and wanting everybody to have a voice and a place at the table. But if the policies don't support that, then we're blocking inclusion. We're blocking a space for all of those voices.
I just want to add to that. I think we have to be very careful because, again, equity is so broad, and there's a need, to address equity with, all groups. But I think we have to focus, right now, we're talking about racial equity because it's been an issue for the longest time. There is already policies and laws in place to address, there's issues that, that may do with, disability, folks who are, for women, when you talk about the LGBTQIA communities, populations. So I think it's very important, yes, that we have to include everyone, but I think we have to address one thing at a time. And right now, the most important thing I think that we have to really address is really looking at the issue of racial equity within our different institutions and organizations. Because I get this all the time where people will say, well, what about me? You know, I mean, yes, communities of color, we have all those intersectionalities. And yes, you know, when we talk about someone who's low income, but again, I just say, let's focus on one thing at a time. And you know what? When you do these equity audits, which now seems everyone's doing them, you have all these organizations and institutions doing equity audits, you're going to start to see these gaps. And some things you can address a little bit easier and quicker than you can addressing the issue of racism. Because it's taken, again, I keep bringing it, you know, racism is something that this country was built on. It's, you know, it's built on white supremacy. It's built, you know, on taking, you know, I identify as an indigenous woman, you know, and it's the lands that were taken. We're still dealing with the history of, you know, where we are as a nation, with racism because of where we started from. So we have to really stay very focused and address on that. And I'm not dismissing, you know, people's questions about equity for other communities, but we really have to stay focused on this. And you can still do that with other groups and other, you know, needs, but let's not lose it, because a lot of times it will dilute, you know, the intentionality that one has in order to address the systemic and cultural and structural racism within our institutions.
All right, so I think we're right up, again, actually slightly past 12 o'clock now, which is sort of our promise to you panelists and our attendees. If everyone could actually, I don't know if you would mind sticking around for maybe just like 10 more minutes, 5 more minutes. There are a couple of questions I did want to get to. We can kind of get to maybe a few tangible steps. Obviously, if anyone needs to jump off, feel free. I think on the website, we actually pushed it to 12:15. But again, maybe just 10 minutes to talk a little bit about steps you can take in culture. Javier, I want to address this question to you. You know, when a lot of what we're talking about is talking about changing the culture of your business and your organization, which can seem like a really big, hard to handle concept. But I know Framingham State, you've talked about you know, some small things that may actually lead to bigger things. But you know, how are you trying to change the culture both from a high elevation level and on the ground?
Well, I think that, you know, it has to be both. It has to come from the top, and we have to also have a grassroots movement at the bottom that sustains that. From the top, I mentioned a moment ago how important it is to hire people that reflect that diversity. And certainly hiring vice presidents that reflect that diversity is really important, because you send the message that this is important. And I think that one way of changing culture, you know, there's a whole thing about hiring that we have to pay attention to. I read recently a very interesting article in the Chronicle of Higher Education asking for the search committees to do not have in-person interviews, to do interviews blindly. If you remember, I believe it was the Vienna Symphony Orchestra a few years ago, started doing blind auditions because they were not hiring any women musicians because they felt that women could not play the violin or whatever that was. When they started doing blind interviews, all of a sudden, a lot of women became members of the orchestra because they were as qualified, as talented as the other people. So making sure that your hiring practices are not discriminating against people by whatever implicit biases that we have, it is a way of really changing that culture. And paying attention to the voices of the students and the people that work in the campus. Students come from all these wonderful backgrounds, and they come full of energy, and they have a lot of ideas. And it is sometimes a little stressful, yes, because they are bringing a lot of things, and students like to protest and to march and to go into offices and to talk to people and to organize events, and etc. And those things take time and take energy, but they have a lot of things to say that we have to listen to them, because that is, in our case, those are our clients, that is our customers. We have to pay attention to what they say. So changing the culture has to be that combination of, from the top, making sure that you are hiring the people that can do that, and from the bottom, bringing the students in and bringing the people that are working in the campus and paying attention to what they say and understanding, like Marcy said a while ago, that somebody came with this idea, one of your employees, of changing the tubes and the old fuses or whatever, the electrical system. They all have something to say, and we all have to learn something from them. So that is, in my mind, the way to really start the conversation about changing that culture and creating a new culture that is inclusive of everybody.
And I think just you had mentioned that, even in the dining halls there at Framingham State, you look to have food that people from those cultures are more used to, that kind of thing too, which is very small but significant.
Those small things are really important. And I always joke that, as we become a Hispanic serving institution, we should have rice and beans in the dining hall once in a while. And actually, yes, our food does reflect a lot. And it's not only Hispanic food. I mean, we have vegan students. We have students that have a religious restrictions about specific types of meats and things that they cannot eat, etc. So you have to really cater to all those students to make them feel that they belong to the institution, and that inclusiveness includes having meals and having food and having things that reflect to them. And actually, food is very important. We all eat, and there is a whole cultural thing about how important food is. So if we want to make people feel included, a diet that includes different foods that reflect different cultures is very important in our dining facilities and cafeterias.
Anyone else on a culture change, big and small?
I think an important place to start, really thinking about the business bottom line and reaching all of your constituents, is thinking about the core values of your institution and your mission statement, right? Because words matter. And what we put down on paper and what we speak is who we are. If you have a mission statement that doesn't even mention racism, anti-racism, efforts around equity and inclusion, there's something missing. An organization establishes the foundations for its commitment to equity and justice in these defining documents. So if you need to revisit your mission statement, I recommend that you do that. And the other personal recommendation I have for leaders is to begin with self-reflection. I think that we need to recognize our whiteness and what that means and how that ties back to our history. And that's all people. How we navigate in a white supremacist society is about whiteness for all people in this nation, not just about people who identify as white. So what do those roots mean for you personally? What has your lived experience been? What is your lens to the world? And how does that define how your interactions happen? How does that reflect your biases, your prejudices, the stereotypes you might carry with you? We all do. We don't do so intentionally, but if you can be introspective about those things, be reflective about self, then the way you show up in your business, in your leadership, and in the world is going to be better. At least you understand where you are, and then you can mitigate those challenges about yourself in your leadership. But if you're not aware of them, if you don't take the time to unpack them, to realize and recognize your lens and your biases, you're kind of navigating blindly, even in good intention.
About what? Oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, and I always like to say that, good intentions pave the way to not a good place oftentimes. But I think, I think one of the most important things that we can just as human beings, because this work that we're doing, it's really about humanity. And how do we come together as people? And how do we come together as humans, for the greater good? And so give yourself, the slack and the opportunity to always be open-minded. And you're going to there's frustration in doing this work. Some of us want this to happen like yesterday. We're not going to, if this is a slow work, and you're not going to see results immediately. It's ongoing work. And I think with that mindset, we have to constantly keep that there. This is ongoing work that has to be intentional. You have to be intentional about it and just continue to do the work and keep being open. And like, Dr. Ceballos said here that, it's having these constant conversations and interacting with others others, and not making assumptions about them. But please keep that in mind. It's ongoing work, and it's going to require that constant presence and mindfulness to continue to do the work within your companies. What you're setting down now, and hopefully, the next person who comes along, you already have something in place there. There's a structure there, creating some kind of cultural shift that started. But it's slow moving. It is very slow moving.
And the author, Oluo, who wrote So You Want to Talk About Race, has a beautiful quote. She says, "You don't need to be free of racism to be anti-racist.
That's right.
Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And it's the only way forward." And I think that takes the pressure off the people that are afraid to say the wrong thing, or don't have all of the information yet, or who don't know where to begin with leaning into the work, or somehow feel like they've offended somebody and they don't want to do it again, so they're going to disengage from the conversation. It's in all of us. We all have work to do, but we have to take a step forward to do it.
Yeah, I think silence is so loud, and I think that if we don't all go forward. Someone said to me, "Well, I can't say anything," a white friend of me, "I can't say anything because I know I'll hurt someone's feelings." Someone alluded to that earlier. And I say, better to stumble and maybe mess up but make an effort and learn from it than to be silent, because your silence will actually be read incorrectly, as if either you don't care or you don't believe there's an issue. So I agree with you.
Silence is complicit.
Exactly.
And actually, in an anti-racist movement, silence is violence against people of color.
Of course it is. It's condoning it.
All right. Well, I'm sure we could probably talk for another 2 hours here, but I know we are up against even our overtime. I'm here. So again, I'd like to just take this time to thank all of our panelists for the time and effort and participation they did today. And then, of course, thanks to all of our sponsors for their sponsorships of today's webcast. I mentioned them earlier. And then, of course, for all of you attendees, everyone will receive an email with a link to today's recording, so you can view it many, many times. And I would just like to thank everyone for joining us today. And we'll have more of these in the future. And I think this has been a great, great conversation. Again, thank you all the panelists.